Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I hope you can see me well. You can hear me well. If you cannot hear well, please flag on the chat that we can try to fix it. So welcome to one more ASTRAIOS webinar. So the ASTRAIOS project is an EU-funded project and that is working to identify the existing space-related education and training across Europe. It's a project. We want to project the future demand for the space skills from European space industry and identify the actions to align and improve the career pathways into the sector. The project started in January 2023 and spans over 3 years, and we are now in the final year, in the final phases of the project. This webinar is part of the webinar series of ASTRAIOS that helps us to help us to reach the goal of improving the existing training material and developing new training material as well, to fill in the gap between the supply and the demand of the space education and training courses. So in today's webinar, we have the pleasure to receive our colleague Michael Marshall, and we will discuss monitoring rangelands carrying capacity with Earth observation. So thanks to Dr. Michael Marshall for accepting to collaborate to our project, to our webinar series. Dr. Marshall is an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources at the University of Twente, at the Faculty of Geoinformation Science and Earth Observation. So I'll give the floor to him so he can introduce better his expertise and his background and go to the presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Michael Marshall. My background is agronomy, food security analysis using remote sensing. I primarily work in Africa, lived there off and on in many parts for 25 years, and then moved here to the Netherlands. Rangeland carrying capacity is of high interest to me, and I will talk about that in the presentation. It's linked to an ESA project I lead called LUISA, and it's an important environmental indicator, and Earth observation is increasingly used to monitor it. Before we begin, however, on that topic, we need to orient you. There are a lot of definitions floating out there in terms of overgrazing, which is the motivator for why we look at carrying capacity, and also carrying capacity itself. So these definitions are not fixed. They're merely here to orient you on the topic. So what is overgrazing? Overgrazing occurs when too many livestock graze in an area for too long without fallowing, which damages grasses and their roots, right? So if cattle or livestock are managed properly, they will graze in an area and then move somewhere else before there is permanent damage to the vegetation or their roots, which is particularly negative. So what are the impacts? These are just a few, and I'd like you to think about some others that I haven't listed here. So the obvious one is there's a reduction in vegetation cover, and because of this, there's increased soil erosion, right? Because the soil is not being bound or held by the roots. Also, the vegetation protect against rainfall, raindrops, and rainfall erosivity is sometimes used as a term. Lower water holding capacity, compaction, right? So the roots improve the soil structure, they prevent compaction, and also help to channel the water. Now, with the reduction in vegetation, other invasive species that are more tolerant often take over, and these are typically unpalatable to livestock. So all of these things, if they persist, can lead to what we call land degradation. And if these negative outcomes persist even further, we can get what's called desertification. So overgrazing is a huge issue. And so this is the main reason why we look at carrying capacity as an indicator, as a sort of health indicator for overgrazing. So upon completion of the webinar, you will be able to explain the concept of carrying capacity, or we're expecting you to be able to in the context of rangeland management. You will calculate carrying capacity using what's called the Noy-Meir model. This is a very simple two-function grazing model. It's fairly intuitive, and it's important because it forms the basis of the more sophisticated models which are used today. And then finally, we will compare carrying capacity methods based on these grazing system models, which are really run sort of at the landscape or field scale, field measurements, which are used, exhaustive data to train the models, and then finally, how Earth observation can basically create a compromise, estimate carrying capacity, but at low cost, consistently over large areas, fairly straightforward methods, etc. So first we'll focus on the supply side of the Noy-Meir equation, which are grasslands or shrublands. Grasslands are the major source of food for livestock. They represent the largest land cover type globally, approximately 50%. And you can see they're fairly well distributed at the mid-latitudes. Here in the yellow, this is a MODIS land cover map from Reeves et al. 2015. You can see they tend to dominate in continental climates. However, in Africa as well, this narrow band here is called the Sahel. It separates tropical Africa from the Saharan desert. This is also a very important area for grasses. Of course, grasses are often mixed with shrubs, so you can see there are other classifications which also fall loosely in this category and are important areas for livestock production. Grasses provide a number of ecosystem services. These are linked to some of the problems I mentioned in the previous slide. They prevent soil erosion by helping soil formation. Nutrient cycling, of course, if the grasses persist, if they're not destroyed, they can absorb CO2, particularly in the soil. They're also good for nitrogen cycling, and they promote biodiversity. You may look at a patch of grass and think, oh, this is all the same grass. No, your back lawn could consist of at least half a dozen different species, right? So grasses are a major source of biodiversity. And they also support low input grazing, and it's an economic output for pastoralists and also for ranch managers. I show here the two main types of managed land we use. One is rangeland. This is very common, say, in sub-Saharan Africa. Pasture, you'll see more in Europe. I'd like you to take a look at these figures and see if you can tell the difference, why a rangeland is a rangeland and why a pasture is a pasture. Maybe you could write it in the chat. What makes a rangeland and what makes a pasture a pasture?
Just chat here.
Natural grasslands, yeah, that's a good observation. So rangelands tend to be more open. They consist exclusively of natural vegetation, whereas pasture can have native vegetation, but it's also, they tend to be seeded, right? So these grasses here were probably seeded by the ranch handler or the farm manager. They also tend to be more enclosed, smaller. Yeah, so that's a nice observation. Great, thank you. Okay, so now let's talk about the demand side of the equation. We'll start globally and then focus on Africa, which is where carrying capacity really, I think, has the potential with Earth observation to make a huge difference. So we live in a world now with increased population growth, rapid population growth, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. There's also widespread urbanization. And with that, you have a growing middle class, particularly in the BRIC countries. And as you tend to have higher incomes, you tend to want to eat more meat, basically. So there's a much higher increase in meat consumption due to this increase in population, but also urbanization and wealthier nations. What are some of the negative impacts? Well, one of them is greenhouse gas emissions. If you overgraze, you destroy vegetation, so CO2 emissions are not absorbed by the soil. Also, livestock produce methane through their flatulence. There's also nitrogen from the dung and through the feces and the urine. Another thing, and probably the elephant in the room, is land use, which is why I include this nice figure here from Our World in Data, which basically breaks down how land is used for various uses. So approximately 30% of the Earth's surface is land. 70% of it is habitable. Now we start getting into some interesting numbers. Half of that is for agriculture. But then when we break down agriculture, 77% of our agriculture is used just for livestock, while only 23% are used for croplands. And why is that striking? Well, in terms of our caloric intake, we only get about 18% of our calories from meat. So it takes up the lion's share of agricultural land use, but only represents a small fraction of our intake. Most of our calories come from plants. And then finally, contrary to what you might think, a lot of people understand that meat is a good source of protein. However, we only get about 40% of our protein from meat. Most of it still comes from plants. Okay, so now in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a striking picture that is emerging because of these global drivers. Of course, there are always regional differences. So as I said before, rapid population growth, particularly in Nigeria and some other countries in Africa, much faster than anywhere else in the world. But unique to Africa, half of pastoralists, these are people that tend livestock, they used to have nomadic lives, are in Africa. And half of Africa is rangeland, right? So the predominant source of agriculture is actually dry areas, these grasses, also dryland crops in Africa. And we've seen a large scale loss of rangeland in Africa due to competing farming, mechanized farms, private ranches, so large commercial farms and ranches. Wildlife reserves, there's a huge push since the end of colonialization to preserve natural parks and wildlife reserves for tourism. Mining and other concessions, which have ramped up, particularly after the 2008 economic crisis, and then urbanization, climate change, and desertification. And all of these conspire to put huge social and cultural pressures on pastoralists who traditionally, as I said, were nomadic, right? Now they're forced to move over much less land and do not get to engage in their traditional practices. So what can we do to move towards more sustainable livestock production in Africa? And there's two basic sides of the equation. If you'd like to learn more, I put this paper here by Holacek et al. 2017. There's a livestock management side and the rangeland management side. We mostly focus on the rangeland management side with these grazing system models or with earth observation, because that's just what they're better at. So they can evaluate things like proper stocking, rotational grazing, like moving livestock around, so that the same place is not fed on too much to destroy the rootstock and ultimately lead to lower biomass levels and land degradation, prescribed burning, which can promote certain nutrients and more vigorous grass growth, water development, fencing, seeding. And then on the livestock management side, this is more to do with improving the quality of livestock. Historically, we've focused on improving the number of livestock, but we've learned actually the quality of the livestock is much more important. So this happens through improved breeding, supplemental feeding, so getting more nutrients in their diet, higher quality feed, grasses, with higher protein content, vaccination to keep them healthy, herd management. So these are the social interactions between livestock, which you might be a bit surprised, but they also need friends too. And record keeping, which is used to basically make sure that these things are done in a timely and efficient manner in an effective way. So carrying capacity is the tool of choice for assessing rangeland management, and it's the one most easily assessed with Earth observation data. And so basically what carrying capacity tells you is how many animals can I put on the land in a sustainable way so they don't eat too much grass, they don't destroy the rootstock, which leads to land degradation, right? And so I show this equation here, or excuse me, this figure, population size in terms of livestock over time. And as you can see, once you put livestock on your grass here, there's going to be the carrying capacity is going to start being achieved, right? The carrying capacity you can think of as a kind of equilibrium. As you add more livestock, you get closer and closer to that carrying capacity. But if you introduce too much livestock, you start getting these fluctuations between what we call overshoot. That's when there's too much livestock, they're eating too much of the grass, too much of the biomass, and you see a decline and these kind of fluctuations. Now, if you keep adding livestock or if the land is not fallowed, then this line could easily start plummeting, right? So the Noy-Meir model is expressed here. It's a simple two-function model, grazing system model. This was kind of one of the first attempts to assess what's the good balance between healthy grass and number of livestock, because obviously you need to feed the livestock. And so how can we do this sort of in a sustainable way? Now, the Noy-Meir model first was published in 1975. I put this paper here. However, I think there are some other papers that are probably a bit easier to read. But basically, you have two sides. That's why it's a two-function model. You have the growth, which is basically the biomass, and a rate. So you can see that expressed in graphical form here. As you increase the biomass, the growth rate increases. So this almost looks like a kind of phenological curve where you have sort of the green up phase, the increase in biomass, the growth rate increases as photosynthesis increases until it reaches sort of peak productivity. And then there's a decline, the senescence phase, when grass turns brown, photosynthesizes less. Now, on the other side, you have the intake, right? That's the demand side, and that's usually expressed as a logarithmic curve, and you can see that here. So the intake rate increases logarithmically with biomass. And so there's, like this equation here, there's a shape function or a shape coefficient. There's also a coefficient to determine the plateau. Basically, when biomass keeps increasing, but the intake rate doesn't increase because basically the cows or livestock, they're eating all that they can, right? You also have this deferment period. This is typical, or a fallowing period, where the livestock is not there consuming the biomass. And so putting these rates together with biomass numbers, you basically get these curves, and these are essentially used for carrying capacity. So you can see here, if you only introduce one animal, it very much follows the growth curve, which is really nice, right? So this is probably sustainable, but as you start introducing more animals, the growth rate is not as high, right? The amplitude keeps decreasing. Also important to note is that it reaches zero, the y-axis, earlier in the growing season, right? And then finally, you have 4 animals. You see there's a decrease, actually the first dip, that means they're eating too much. And so that is reflected in the productivity. And then this brown line here, you can't even see, this is 5 animals, which means it doesn't even reach peak productivity. So now This is, and if you don't like equations, then just skip this part of the webinar. But these are the curves expressed in an equation form. And so basically you have the supply side here, which is governed by this growth rate coefficient, G, and then you have V, which is your biomass. And then you have this Vx, which is essentially the maximum attainable biomass in the absence of grazing. This is your amplitude. So these define the shape of the curve. And then this one's a bit more complicated. This is the intake side. You have the animal density, the maximum intake by the animal, and then you have your biomass again. And then you also have VR, which is the residual biomass, below which intake rate is 0. So this is another shape. This is your basically governing the plateau of your logarithmic curve. And then VS is the shape parameter or the shape function. So this is what it looks like in graphical form. Now what I'd like to do is take you through it step by step. With this example, a rangeland contains a peak herbaceous biomass Vx of 3650 kilograms per hectare each year without grazing. After how many days from the start of the year will the rangeland be depleted if 3 animals per hectare are grazing? For this example, we assume typical Mediterranean conditions. And these are the factors here. Where did I get them? I got them from a paper. So I didn't make them up. This is important as well. V increases without grazing. So this is the biomass if it was unaffected by livestock at a rate of 10 kilograms per hectare per day. Okay, so this is the example. This is something we can answer. This is something that would be important to, say, pastoralists or land managers, right? So let me see if I can easily, okay. So this is the solution, and in the Excel spreadsheet, which I'll show now, I'll show you how I got here, but you can see here, this is your curve, the biomass change rate versus days. And you can see there's an increase in the beginning, and that's because the land has been left fallow. But then as soon as the livestock are introduced, there's a decrease in biomass. It does reach peak productivity, but after 261 days, the curve starts to go negative. And that's bad. Okay, so let's see if I can get you to the Excel spreadsheet. So this is how we calculated it using that fancy equation I showed you in the PowerPoint presentation. You can see the inputs here, 3650 for maximum biomass, the growth rate, the residual threshold, which is governing the peak of the peak or plateau, I should say, of the logarithmic curve, and the intake rate curve, which governs the shape of the logarithmic curve. And then you have these other numbers. And then here, this is the increased 10 kilograms per day for the biomass. And then you can see, basically, I've left the fallowing period here. So basically, there's no change in intake because the livestock aren't there. Yeah. And so you can see here's the growth equation. Yeah. So this is just from the PowerPoint presentation. It just uses Vx and G, and then V, your biomass. And then you also have the intake, which I show here, much more complicated. But now, yeah, you're using the residual threshold, the VR, VS, IX, and H. Yeah. So these are the equations. And then you can see them in graphical form here. Yeah. And then over here, sorry, I couldn't fit it all in one spreadsheet. You can also, so that's the supply side, and this is the demand side. Yeah. And putting them together, basically, sorry, it's, yeah, if we start scrolling down, I want you to focus on the intake. Yeah. Oh, and then here, the animals times 3 on the side. This is where it's positive. This is the resultant. So let's see where it starts to go negative. Yeah. So it's increasing, increasing, increasing. But then all of a sudden, after 261 days, right, it starts to decrease. And that's because the animals have exhausted the supply. And you can see it expressed here, basically. Yeah. So in a typical Mediterranean climate, livestock graze for about 120 days. So that means that basically this manager has let the livestock exceed that limit by about 161 days, which is bad. So ideally, what you would want to do is probably have fewer livestock in the beginning and certainly pull them off the land much sooner than 261 days. So this is just a basic application of the model, but you can see how it can start being used. Of course, nowadays, these models are much more sophisticated, right? So this is what we now call an integrated grading system model. And there are different ones I list here. They all have different parameterizations, functionalities, like Grazplan, AFSM, and Savannah, I believe, are used primarily in the Southern Hemisphere, where some of these others, like APSM, are used kind of all over the place. If you were to start using one of these models, APSM would probably be a good place to start because it's got a huge user community, a lot of functionality, and like I said, it's used all over the world. But in short, if you'd like to know more, I have this reference here for SNOW 2018. But in short, basically, they take the Noy-Meir model, but expand it beyond just the sort of biomass production and intake by factoring in these other cycles, like water cycling, so the impact of rainfall, evapotranspiration, carbon cycling, so the impact of CO2 fertilization, greenhouse gas emissions. This could be methane from livestock flatulence or from urine or feces, nitrogen, and then carbon sequestration. So this is mostly in the rootstock, and nitrogen leaching, which is basically coming from it's nitrogen leached into the soil through the livestock feces and urine. So one of the interesting things I find with these integrated models, and not all of them do this, this is still a fairly emergent topic. You can see Butts et al. 2022, I think, is the first really to introduce what is called agent-based modeling to really account for these plant-animal interactions. Historically, we've been very focused on the supply side, but and not so much on the demand side. So this is really trying to capture the different types of interactions. Agent-based modeling is a sort of data-driven technique, which is deterministic in nature, but does introduce a stochastic or random element to it. But it's really good sort of at the farm level to see how people or livestock interact. You can see this in a nice graphic here. Basically, there are 3 livestock, say, in this system, expressed in distance, in meters, not in latitude or longitude, but you can imagine this being latitude and longitude as well. And basically, these lines here show sort of the movement of these livestock. And you can see, for example, livestock 1 and 2, they're not really interacting, whereas livestock 2 and 3 are. And that's partially due, I think, to the fact that livestock 2 is quite greedy. It's moving over a much wider area than the other livestock. But you can imagine, based on these interactions, probably the highest potential for overgrazing is here, where the lines converge. Right? So I just show here the different interactions: plant-animal, selective grazing, waste deposition, trampling. These are basically effects of animals on the land. Animal-animal, this is competition, which you can see expressed well here with the agent-based model, which puts higher demand on forage, especially if livestock are grazing in the same area. And animal behavior relations, so how do they feel about each other? How does their psychology affect their eating habits, their production, that sort of thing. Forage production, so this is increasingly important. There's an opportunity here with remote sensing, looking at phenological changes. So historically, these models were run, say, over a year, but we know now that there are usually multiple years, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, multiple rainy seasons. So we need to look at changes in phenology. So it's not just about moving the cattle or livestock from one place to the other in a given year. It's also about moving them in a particular season, right? Multiple species, right? So there are several different grass species, all with different levels of production. And quality, this is another emerging issue. It's not just that they get enough calories, but is it high quality, high nitrogen content, protein content, which is important for production and also to maintain health. Now, animal production, there are issues here. I would say this is very emergent. The models are probably not well at handling this at the moment. Genetic variations, say, in cattle, and genetic and management trade-offs as well. Like certain species you could imagine might be highly productive, but don't work well together in a herd, right? Which affects the psychology. Okay, so now just a bit more on the basically how these models work. And I just focus on a few of the important cycles. So one of them is the carbon and nitrogen cycle, and you can see this, I think, well displayed or well illustrated by the POSSUM model. There is a citation for this if you're interested, but it basically shows the main ways that CO2 emissions and nitrogen emissions are affected in a given landscape, right? So you have photosynthesis, which absorbs carbon, and this is allocated to the vegetation, but also to the root. And some of this is then deposited or absorbed by the soil and can be distributed and also change in chemistry due to sort of different temporal processes. So one of the outputs in terms of CO2 into the air is autotrophic respiration. Yield decomposition can also lead to CO2 emissions and heterotrophic respiration. So this is respiration that happens in the soil by, say, worms or nematodes. Methane, also from the animal. Flatulence, of course, huge issue. And then you, of course, have nitrogen through its various processes, leaching, denitrification, volatilization, which leads to a number of nitrogen outputs, nitrous oxide, nitrates, etc., ammonia. Yeah, so this is just a nice schematic, I think, that shows you why these models are so sophisticated. They require a number of inputs. And this is also a good defense of why we look at remote sensing. Rayan here probably would argue, well, we need machine learning. So that's a story for a different day. I'm focused on the process-based models because this is what we historically used. But certainly there are emerging topics in machine learning, deep learning on this topic. GrassPlan, I thought provided, and I have a citation here, Bremer et al. 2001, provides a nice schematic of water cycling, which now we're talking about changes in the energy balance, the surface energy balance, sensible heat, which is the heat we feel. This is the dominant energy source for soil, and latent heat, which is the heat that's dissipated by vegetation. This is also known as evapotranspiration. This provides a kind of cooling effect. If you've ever walked around barefoot in the summertime on hot pavement, that hot heat is the sensible heat. When you jump on the grass, it feels nice and cool and moist. That's your latent heat. So that's what these models are really trying to account for, and its impact ultimately on the water balance. So that's soil moisture, storage, etc. Okay, so we focused on the grazing system models. These are historically the main ways we assess carrying capacity, but of course there are field methods. That's the second way we look at things. Third way is earth observation. I won't go into a lot of detail here, just to show you that these surveys are quite extensive. They collect a lot of data, and these data can be used to estimate carrying capacity and manage livestock, but basically at a very local level. However, these are also the types of data that you need in order to run the grazing system models. So a lot of data, a lot of input, a lot of cost. So of course, These are all major motivations for looking at Earth observation data. And so I provide a brief justification here why Earth observation. While rangelands, as you've seen, they're highly variable, the types of species, different soil types, different rainfall regimes, different parts of the world. And there's also a diversity in animal species, different livestock, types of livestock, but even species of the same livestock. Diverse management practices. So you have pastoralism, but you also have pasture land, which are managed very differently. And management decisions need to be made, but often over large areas at critical times. And so that's why Earth observation is so important, because Earth observation can take measurements frequently over the Earth's surface, large areas consistently through time. Integrated grazing system models are rarely applied beyond the farmer community level for a single growing season, right? So they're extremely limited. They are widely used, but extremely limited, basically. So in walks Earth observation. So what can we do with Earth observation? Now, I don't want to sell it. It can't do everything. It has its limitations, but these are just some of the potential applications, the indicators we use to address those applications, and the modeling methods, right? So the common applications are a proxy or direct measure of rangeland production. So really the supply side of the equation, which is important for carrying capacity. We can also look at driving factors, right? What's driving production? Is it the timing of the vegetation? Is it temperature? Is it rainfall? Really focused on the biophysical side, still very important for carrying capacity. And then some management options, which include changes in the landscape or texture due to mowing or grazing. For those of you in agronomy, you might be more familiar with tillage. All of these things modify the texture of the landscape, which we can detect with remote sensing. So these are the common indicators we use. Normalized difference vegetation index historically was the most common. This index is sensitive to chlorophyll in vegetation and photosynthesis, but also in production through what's called the near infrared plateau in terms of structure and amount. And you can derive a number of factors from that. But more sophisticated approaches, which I'll briefly expand upon in the subsequent slides, include light use or production efficiency models. These are sometimes called big leaf models. They help translate basically the light absorbed by vegetation into how much is produced by the vegetation, how much CO2, which is ultimately how much biomass, how much production. And then very sophisticated, what are called multi-leaf models, radiative transfer models like ProSail. And then analytical methods, data-driven techniques are often used with these indicators to address one of these applications. Regression analysis was traditionally used, like stepwise regression, not so much anymore. And then finally, trend analysis, looking at trends through time to see, are biomass levels being maintained, or has there been some kind of tipping point or recovery period, et cetera. So this is just a brief overview of remote sensing, rangeland management from 1972, which was when Landsat 1 was launched, and basically all the various missions that have been involved. It's not an exhaustive list, but I think pretty comprehensive. If you'd like to read more, I have the citation here by Matthew Reeves. But you can see, Landsat really was the only thing we could really utilize in the 70s and early 80s, then AVHRR. You might know GIMS, NDVI 3G. I think they have a 4G product now. That then kind of took over very coarse resolution, but then in the late 90s, you start seeing very much higher spatial resolution data emerge. ResourceSat, which is Indian Space Agency, Terra Aqua Modus, and then a number of commercial products. Right? And with this, we were able to get better estimates of production, land cover type, phenology, the things that we need for our carrying capacity estimation. Okay, so now I think an interesting application of Earth observation, which does connect to carrying capacity, is encapsulated here in the ESA LUISA project. This is an ESA project that will be ending this year, one that I lead on. And what it's calculating is what's called the Human Appropriated Net Primary Productivity Index, HUMP. It's a continental product, so we're estimating HUMP across Africa at 300-meter spatial resolution, but in our case study regions, we're doing it at 20-meter resolution. And what HUMP does is it basically helps us to allocate carbon on the landscape. What is carbon being used for? Is too much being used? Is not enough? Is there sequestration? Is there emissions? These sorts of things. So it's a carbon monitoring tool, which is important for climate change mitigation. And you can see it expressed here in graphical form. NPP potential, net primary production, this is your biomass. This is the maximum that could be produced in the landscape if it was natural and basically not influenced by human behavior. But of course, humans do interfere. And so then we break down HUMP according to land use, land cover change, harvest. And this is where carrying capacity comes in, because you can harvest land for crops, but also for livestock. So that's where we get the Earth observation-based carrying capacity estimates. And then, of course, the remaining NPP or biomass, this is after these factors have been removed. The unused part, you could think of things like crop residue. So this is biomass that remains on the field, but is technically harvested. I won't go into details here, but these are the broad overviews. So not only are we basically coming up with better ways of estimating carrying capacity and ultimately HUMP with Earth observation, but we've developed a really nice decision support tool, which if you're interested in, you just click on this QR code and it will take you there. It's an interactive tool. You don't need any software. Hopefully it's pretty straightforward, and you can see basically how we're using now Earth observation carrying capacity for a real world application. And this is a tool that is already being used by stakeholders working in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is basically how we estimate carrying capacity with Earth observation. We have what is called dry matter productivity. I'll talk about that in a subsequent slide. This is essentially your biomass. We have world clim temperature, mean annual temperature. This helps us to determine how much of the biomass in the field, as detected with PROBA-V, that's a remote sensing platform, how much of that is actually above ground, how much of it is below ground. Now, ideally, you don't want the livestock feeding on the below ground biomass, because that's your root stock, and you'll kill the vegetation, which will lead to a lower level of support for biomass. And then, of course, very basic model, DM, digital elevation, so topography is there. So the idea is that livestock prefer and are able to feed on shallow slopes. They're not going to be feeding on very steep cliffs or anything like that. And that leads to what we call the proper use factor. In reality, though, this factor is much more sophisticated, but of course, we're limited by the data that we have. So we consider this a kind of first order estimate of the proper use factor. And then gridded livestock density, which tells you the number of livestock per pixel globally. And from that and the total body weight, which is usually estimated with national statistics or global or even continental statistics, you get the demand side, the livestock requirement. So the difference between these is your carrying capacity. This is in equation form how we calculate net primary production, NPP. So it's basically GPP, your gross primary production, which is your biomass after respiration costs have been accounted for. So biomass after you subtract the biomass lost, if you will, through respiration. This is calculated on a daily basis over the growing season and then summed to get your NPP. And then with a sleight of hand, a little conversion factor here, we get the dry matter productivity. So this is or production, this is your biomass. And then that's how we calculate it. The production efficiency model optimized for diverse ecosystems, PMOD. This is a model I developed. It was published in RSC in 2018. It's a very simple light use efficiency model that basically converts the amount of light received by the canopy into your biomass, your GPP. And it's affected by a number of constraints like carbon use efficiency, the fraction of photosynthetically active radiation, that's the green part, if you will, of the vegetation, the leaf age, which of course can affect photosynthesis, moisture, temperature. Not so important to know all these equations, but this class of model works in similar ways. Other models like CASA are similar. This one is interesting or unique because it's calibrated with field data and ecovariance flux tower data. That's what makes it special. Also, it's my model. So anyway, production efficiency approach. Why do we use this? Well, because it's simple to run over large areas and typically performs as well as these radiative transfer or multi-model approaches, even though the response of biomass to light, biomass production to light is nonlinear, right? Canopies are heterogeneous, but it seems that the assumptions of big leaf models or production efficiency models are valid in most cases. Radiative transfer models are also extremely complex. They require a lot of input data, so that could be another shortcoming. Okay, and then on the demand side, the gridded livestock of the world, data set 2010. So this is the best we can do. It's 10-kilometer resolution, so it's very coarse. And of course, livestock do migrate. So I'm sure since 2010, there have been some changes. But like I said, this is the only gridded data set we have. I think it was developed at Columbia University. And so basically, it uses subnational livestock statistics or FAUSTAT polygons and what's called disometric weighting to basically dissolve, if you will, these nationals or coarse statistics to the pixel level. And it does that using a number of friction surfaces. We call them like population density, vegetation indices, topography, etc. Now, this particular version, version 3, I don't know if there's a version 4 now. You could check it out. This is the paper, though. It's from 2018. In the past, they used stepwise regression. Now they use more sophisticated machine learning approaches. Yeah. Okay, so in summary, overgrazing, sustainable development goal, life on land is important. Grazing occurs mostly in grasslands, but is unsustainable. So this will make it difficult for us to achieve SDG 15. Carrying capacity is a tool we can use to monitor sustainability because it can help offset degradation by decreasing, at the very basic level, lower livestock numbers and longer fallowing periods. Grazing system models are too complex, particularly for large areas, for which rangeland management is very important, as you can see, because of its open nature. Earth observation methods are emerging and seem to be filling in some of the major limitations of these models. Now, production efficiency models are not the best, and there are some important areas of research worth exploring. So for those of you watching this and have an interest in this topic, this might be something worth thinking about in terms of your own work. These interseasonal dynamics, so we tend to focus on 1, maybe 2 seasons in the year, but can we push these models to account for interseasonal variability and then variability in livestock across seasons, across years? Integrating forage quality, this is an emerging issue, possibly with hyperspectral remote sensing. Shrublands, woodland grasses, so other land cover types, these should be better addressed. And it's very challenging sometimes to know what part of those particular landscape covers are used for feeding and which aren't. And then other drivers like soil erosion to better refine this proper use factor. And of course, ESA in particular, NASA also, there are a lot of new sensors coming up, hyperspectral sensors, radar-based sensors, biomass, fluorescence. All of these provide opportunities with machine learning and deep learning to better capture inputs for livestock information, carrying capacity, but also to address that complexity, which is a critical issue at the moment. Okay, so if you don't mind, I know we're starting to run over. You'd like some questions to be answered, hopefully. So what I'd like to do is just briefly show you the tool that we developed. You can click on the website if you want. And so this takes you to the data portal. There is a website linked to this as well. So basically, we focused on 4 case study regions: Ethiopia, Uganda, Mozambique, and Senegal. I'll click on Senegal just because this was our main pastoral system, civil pastoral system. So this is where carrying capacity with Earth observation really played an important role. And you can read more about it here. And then this is just kind of some of the functionality of the tool. You can see here, net primary productivity. This is your biomass. We estimated at very high spatial resolution, relatively speaking, with Sentinel-2. So you can see a lot of features, farm features that are picked out. You can zoom all over the case study area, by the way. I'm just showing this small snapshot due to time limitations. And then we also developed a continental scale product where the production is at 300 meter. And then, of course, from this, we get things like harvest and then ultimately the hump, the HAMPP. So you can interrogate it. There's a lot of feature functionality with this. I should point out, too, at the end of the project, the intermediate products that fed into this will be available on something like Apex, which is the ESA version of GitHub, or GitHub itself. We haven't decided yet. So do be on the lookout. We produced a lot of nice products. We're just showing the main products here on the data portal. So with that, I think I can close my presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. It was a very interesting, very nice presentation. I have some questions here in the chat that I will ask for you, and just to emphasize again for the people watching, usually we don't mention the names of the people that asked the questions because of the recording. This goes later to YouTube, and the privacy agreement that everyone signed doesn't allow us to mention the names. Okay, so first, is there a relationship between biomass intake and livestock breed? For example, some breeds consume more biomass than others due to difference in grazing efficiency or nutritional requirements. How do you model these differences?
Yeah, so with remote sensing, we can't, right? So that's the major limitation at the moment of remote sensing, is we mostly can estimate the production side of the equation. The only management we really can do is in terms of what we can see with the remote sensing devices. So things like tillage, if you were talking about croplands, but basically mowing or any kind of textural modification of the surface, we can pick up with remote sensing. But in terms of livestock, there's not much we can do. There are people that are using very high spatial resolution remote sensing, UAV technology, aerial photos, even commercial satellites to count livestock. You can certainly do that. You can get numbers. But yeah, it's very difficult to get any more from that, like species variations. Of course, yeah, different species eat different amounts of livestock. Even within species, you have variations, right? Their psychology can affect things, their interactions with other livestock, none of these. But I would argue the integrated grazing system models are also not very good at that kind of stuff, even if you have exhaustive field data, right? So yeah, we can't overpromise remote sensing, right? That's a danger. A lot of Earth observation scientists do, they overpromise. So at the moment, yeah, that's honestly the best we can do.
Thanks. And in that sense, because I imagine that in many cases, instead of the integration, they use rotational practices or something like that. Does that help to improve efficiency and reduce the impact and reduce land degradation and so on? What is the most efficient way in terms of the process of the farming? What's the most efficient way of doing this practice and reduce the impacts for the environment, for land degradation and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so ideally, the main things that managers can do, right, is to fallow the land, and that gives enough time for the biomass to recover. Because the main problem is with overgrazing is not destroying the vegetation itself, it'll grow back, it's the root stock. If you destroy the root stock, then the land will inevitably support a much lower sort of level of biomass, and it progressively gets worse and worse because of the land degradation. So fallowing helps with that, and then reducing the number of livestock, right? So instead of having, say, as I showed in the graph, five, maybe you have two or one in a particular area. And so and by rotating grazing, right, you're shifting the livestock to other areas so that, once they've fed, and biomass levels are reduced, but to the point where they can still recover, then that gives the time for the land to heal, and then they go graze somewhere else. Now, the major challenge, and sorry, I work mostly in Africa, the major challenge there is land fragmentation, poor land tenure, right? It's very unequitable. So, rotational grazing, of course, is great. And in the past, it worked really well because people were nomadic and they moved over thousands of kilometers, right? Uh, and now that's not possible, right? So they're quite restricted in where they can graze.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Another question here is because we see a kind of a dynamics on the overgrazing that leads usually to land degradation, and I imagine that this leads also to a reduction in the food and water security.
Yeah.
How these dynamics, this cycle varies across countries in the countries you study, of course. Do you have data or any studies on that?
You mean, okay, in terms of food security, look, it's not really my expertise, but I can say, for example, there was the East African drought a few years back. This had a tremendous impact on the Greater Horn of Africa, the GHA. So this is Ethiopia, Kenya, this part of Africa. And that's because pastoralists work in what are called climate fringe areas. These are areas that are highly susceptible to drought and other climate extremes. They're dry, low vegetation cover, etc. So highly susceptible, and this led to major food insecurity, even famine, because of this persistent drought. Now, it's important to note with pastoralists is, when a farmer maybe has 1 year of failure, right, their crops due to drought, okay, it's bad, but they have a good shot at recovering next year, right? Whereas with pastoralists, if they lose that livestock, that's it. It's, I mean, if you know East Africa in particular, I mean, livestock are as valuable as cars, right? So if you lose that livestock, that's the end of your livelihood. You can't recover that very easily. But yeah, the rest of Africa, I can't say too much, but Africa, 80% of the agricultural production, including livestock, is supported in these dry areas. So I'm sure other parts of Africa too, the Sahel, do experience these fluctuations. Now, in the western part, I do know the Sahel region. At the moment, they are in this greening period above average rainfall. So I haven't heard much on that side of the continent, but certainly East Africa. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I think we have time for one last question. How can we use Earth observation, agent-based modeling, and field-based methods to how we can integrate them effectively to support some more comprehensive analysis and improve decision making in terms of improving not only the efficiency but also the security for the communities and the pastoralists and all the involved stakeholders in this process.
So, okay, so that's a great question too. There's, from a methodological perspective, and this is really not very well developed field, unfortunately. I think it's not attractive enough to enough people, right? But the grazing system models, they could undergo something what's called data assimilation. So this is integrating remote sensing data, the production side, which is what remote sensing is really good at, into the models in a way to correct certain factors in the model and reduce uncertainty in the models. So these models that use agent-based modeling maybe are handling better the demand side where remote sensing is weak. But you can also imagine two hybrid models, right? Again, like I don't know if there's any papers around out there about this. Yeah, where you use these process-based models to sort of confine the solution space, if you will, of deep learning models, setting some boundary conditions. Yeah, so yeah, and then in terms of what the models can be used for, I do talk about it a bit. The grazing system models can be used for basically choosing better livestock species or for vaccination or improving forage quality and health, but also for managing the rangeland as well. So managers can use that information basically to make sure that the landscape stays healthier, the livestock are healthier, so better production, more production, but higher quality production, and also maintaining the land. Now, at say a national level, I guess decision makers can use this information. You can imagine like the tool we're developing is really targeting national stakeholders. They can use the tool basically to design better policies, better interventions, where to allocate resources, what to allocate resources with. And then that similarly, international stakeholders can do the same through their donors. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much, Michael.
Cool.
So we come to an end of our webinar today, and I would like to thank you everyone for this, and I'll just share some more information about our project. So thank you everyone that joined us. For those that are interested in more information about the project, about the material we have developed and everything, we have here our links to our LinkedIn, where we post all the webinars, materials, and all the news about the project. Here's the website of the project, our X account, our X profile, that before was Twitter, and our YouTube channel as well. This video will be posted there in the YouTube channel. So Michael, thank you very much again for that, and we come to the end of one more webinar. The next one will be after the summer break, and we will post the news in our communication channels. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone. Nice interacting with you.